The death of Sophia Dorothea. Sophia Dorothea, also known as the Duchess of Ahlden, passed away on November 13th, 1726, at the age of 60. Her final years were marked by loneliness and declining health, leading to her death from liver failure caused by gallstones. Her death was announced without ceremony, and despite her royal connections, her burial was delayed and conducted in secret. Sophia Dorothea was born on the 15th of September 1666 and she died in 1726. She was married off to her first cousin George, who would later become King George I of Great Britain. Their marriage, which was set up by her father, his father and his mother, didn't end very well. Sophia Dorothea is famously known for her supposed romantic relationship with Count Philip Christoph, which eventually led to her being locked up in the castle of Ahlden for the last 30 years of her life. George blamed Sophia for abandoning their marriage and demanded a divorce. He had her arrested and kept in a castle during the divorce. On the 28th of December 1694, their marriage was officially ended, and Sophia Dorothea was blamed for leaving her husband. She lost all of her titles and privileges. She was not allowed to remarry or see her children, and she was not even mentioned in church prayers. After their divorce, George sent her to live in Ahlden House, which was more like a prison, despite being a large and fancy home. Her ex-husband took control of her property and gave her a yearly allowance for her living expenses. Initially, she got 8,000 thalers, but this later increased to 28,000. Paid for by both George and her father. She lived in a secure part of the castle, constantly watched by guards. Although her mother could visit her freely, her mail and other visits were heavily monitored. Sophia Dorothea never tried to escape. At first she could only walk in the courtyard by herself, but later on she was allowed to walk in the garden with guards, and after 2 years she could go on short, supervised outings. Sometimes she was moved to other castles due to wars or renovations. Her staff included loyal servants such as 2 ladies-in-waiting, several chambermaids and kitchen staff. After being locked away, Sophia Dorothea was called the Duchess of Ahlden, and initially she was very passive and accepted her situation. However, as time passed, she tried to get her freedom back. In 1698, after her former father-in-law passed away, she sent a heartfelt letter to her ex-husband, expressing her daily prayers for him and pleading for forgiveness and a chance to see their children again. She also wrote to her former mother-in-law, wishing for a chance to meet her one last time. Sadly, neither responded to her appeals. In 1705, her father wanted to see her one final time on his deathbed. However, his advisor objected, fearing it might upset diplomatic relationships with Hanover. Her father died without them reconciling. During her time in prison, Sophia Dorothea showed her generosity by donating a large amount of money to rebuild the town of Ahlden after a severe fire in 1715. Her mother's death in 1722 left her completely alone. When her daughter, now the Queen of Prussia, visited Hanover in 1725, Sophia Dorothea dressed carefully and waited by the window every day, hoping to see her daughter, but she never did. Sophia's later years were marred by health problems. She became significantly overweight, and her well-being was frequently undermined by febrile colds that left her shivering and miserable, along with persistent indigestion that made meals a source of discomfort rather than pleasure. Her physical ailments continued to worsen, culminating in early 1726 when she suffered a debilitating stroke. This marked the beginning of a steep decline in her health. By August of that year, Sophia's condition deteriorated further. She was struck by a severe bout of colic, a painful abdominal condition that confined her to her bed. Griped by intense pain, she became increasingly despondent and refused all forms of food and medical treatment. Her refusal to eat or seek help suggested a deep resignation to her fate. perhaps hastened by the cumulative toll of her illnesses and the isolation that she felt in her later years. Her life came to a quiet end just before midnight on the 13th of November 1726 at the age of 60. Following her death, an autopsy was performed which revealed the extent of her internal afflictions. The doctors discovered that she had succumbed to liver failure. Additionally, her gallbladder was obstructed, a condition compounded by the presence of 60 gallstones, a staggering number that underscored the severe underlying medical issues that she'd faced. Sophia Dorothea's death was noted with minimal fanfare. Her former husband, from whom she had been estranged for many years, placed a brief announcement in the London Gazette stating that the Duchess of Ahlden had passed away. Notably, he expressly forbade any public displays of mourning in both London and Hanover, reflecting the continued estrangement and possibly unresolved bitterness between them. His disdain for any form of mourning was further evidenced by his reaction to the news that members of his daughter's court in Berlin had donned black attire in mourning. Reports indicate that he was incensed upon hearing this, although his reasons remain rooted in the complexities of their personal and political histories. In the immediate aftermath of her death, the guards of Ahlden were tasked with handling her remains. They placed her body in a lead coffin and temporarily stored it in a cellar, a stark and somewhat unbefitting resting place for a woman of her station. The initial plan was for a quiet interment in the local cemetery of Ahlden. However, this plan was thwarted by weeks of relentless heavy rain that rendered the cemetery inaccessible. As a result, her coffin was returned to the cellar and hastily covered with sand, a provisional measure that underscored the somewhat chaotic and undignified handling of her burial. It was not until May 1727, several months after her death, that conditions finally allowed for Sophia to be buried. The delayed burial took place without any ceremony, quietly, and without mourning typically afforded to individuals of her rank. The austere and almost forgotten conclusion to her life stands in stark contrast to the complexities and intrigues that had marked her earlier years as a consort caught in the turbulent cross-currents of European nobility. Her final resting place, devoid of pomp or significant recognition, perhaps epitomizes the isolation and neglect that she experienced in her final years, far removed from the power and influence that she once defied her life.